Ladies and gentlemen, I want to begin with a word so small that we often underestimate its power. It is a word with only 2 letters, a word children learn early and adults spend a lifetime trying to unlearn, disguise, soften, or apologize for. It slips out of the mouth quickly, yet it lands with extraordinary force. Entire conversations change direction because of it. Relationships wobble or stabilize around it. Careers are redirected by it. That word is no. Philosophically speaking, this is already curious. How can something so minimal, barely a sound, carry such disproportionate psychological and social weight? When we encounter such a symmetry between size and effect, the philosopher's instinct should awaken, because it signals that something deep is going on beneath the surface of ordinary behavior. Now, from an evolutionary point of view, which is where I like to start, this phenomenon becomes even more intriguing. Our ancestors survived not because they were lone geniuses, but because they coordinated, cooperated, and aligned themselves with others. Agreement was often safer than refusal. Saying yes meant belonging. Saying no risked exclusion. Over thousands of generations, minds that were sensitive to social approval flourished. As a result, modern humans inherit nervous systems finely tuned to avoid conflict and rejection. When you feel a jolt of anxiety at the thought of saying no, that is not a moral failing. It is ancient machinery doing exactly what it was designed to do. The trouble begins when we mistake this inherited discomfort for wisdom. This helps explain why saying no often feels dangerous, rude, or even immoral, while saying yes feels virtuous, cooperative, and safe. Our intuitions whisper that harmony is always good and resistance is always bad. But intuitions, as I've argued throughout my work, are not sacred truths. They are useful shortcuts that evolved under particular conditions. When conditions change, those shortcuts can mislead us. The modern world places unprecedented demands on our attention, time, and compliance. If we obey our intuitions blindly, we become vulnerable to overload and manipulation. Philosophical reflection begins precisely at this point, when what feels natural no longer reliably tracks what is actually good for us. Tonight, I want to explore the art of saying no, not as an act of selfishness, but as an act of intelligence. Intelligence, after all, is not just about solving puzzles or passing exams. It is about responding appropriately to complexity. A mind that cannot refuse is not a generous mind, it is an unprotected one. Saying no is one of the mechanisms by which a cognitive system regulates itself, filters inputs, and preserves its capacity to function well over time. When understood this way, refusal is not a breakdown of cooperation, but a condition for sustainable cooperation. Without selective restraint, even the best intentions collapse under their own weight. I also want to show you that learning to say no is not about closing doors. It is about designing better minds, better lives, and better societies. Design is a word I use deliberately. Minds are not static objects. They are evolving systems shaped by habits, incentives, and feedback. Every time you say yes or no, you reinforce a pattern. Over time, these patterns solidify into character. Saying no thoughtfully is a way of sculpting your future self, not through grand resolutions, but through small, repeatable acts of judgment. From this perspective, refusal becomes a tool for self-authorship rather than an expression of stubbornness. And I want to do this the way philosophers should do it, not by preaching, but by examining what problem this behavior solves what illusions surround it, and how we can use it more wisely. Philosophy earns its keep when it clarifies confused concepts and exposes hidden assumptions. In this case, the illusion is that goodness requires constant agreement. The problem is that unfiltered agreement erodes agency. The solution is not to become contrarian, but to become reflective, to insert a moment of reasoning between impulse and response. That pause, that small space for thought, is where freedom quietly lives. So as we move forward, keep this idea in mind. The significance of no is not located in its volume, its sharpness, or its emotional charge, but in its role within a system of reasons. A well-placed no can protect your time, your values, and your ability to say yes when it truly matters. When we understand this, we stop treating refusal as a failure of character and begin to see it as a mark of cognitive maturity. And that shift in understanding, subtle though it may seem, has the power to change not just individual lives, but the norms by which whole communities operate. Human beings are, above all, social animals. Long before we were philosophers, engineers, or moralists, we were members of tribes whose survival depended less on individual brilliance than on coordination and trust. Reputation mattered because it predicted future cooperation. Belonging mattered because isolation was often a death sentence. In such a world, social harmony was not a luxury, it was a survival strategy. Minds that were sensitive to approval, that flinched at disapproval, were more likely to pass on their genes. So it should not surprise us that modern humans feel a deep, almost visceral pull toward agreement. That pull is not weakness. It is the echo of an ancient success story written into our nervous systems. In that ancestral environment, saying no could be genuinely costly. Refusing to share food might mark you as untrustworthy. Rejecting group norms could invite punishment or expulsion. Defying authority might provoke violence. These were not hypothetical risks. They were regular features of life. Natural selection does not care about dignity or autonomy. It cares about replication. So psychological mechanisms that nudged individuals toward compliance were strongly favored. What we now experience as guilt, anxiety, or discomfort when we say no once functioned as protective alarms. They steered behavior away from socially dangerous territory long before reflective reasoning had a chance to intervene. As a result, our minds evolved a powerful and largely unconscious bias toward agreement. In my work, I often emphasize that such features should not be moralized prematurely. They are not virtues or vices. They are competences shaped by historical pressures. The tendency to say yes is a design feature, not a flaw. It worked remarkably well for a very long time. Problems arise only when we forget that every design is context dependent. A hammer is a wonderful tool until you try to use it to fix a computer. Likewise, an agreement-biased mind can become maladaptive when the environment shifts in ways evolution never anticipated. And here is the philosophical twist that matters today. A design feature can quietly turn into a liability when conditions change. The modern social environment is not a small tribe with limited demands. It is a sprawling network of institutions, technologies, and incentives that continuously compete for access to your behavior. The same mechanisms that once protected you from exclusion now expose you to exploitation. When every request feels urgent and socially sanctioned, the ancient alarm system misfires. It treats inconvenience as danger and overload as obligation, blurring the line between genuine cooperation and quiet coercion. Modern life bombards us with requests, and it does so at a scale and speed unprecedented in human history. Requests for our time arrive through screens that never sleep. Requests for our attention are engineered by algorithms optimized to bypass reflection. Requests for our emotional labor come wrapped in moral language that discourages refusal. Requests for obedience are often disguised as efficiency, loyalty, or professionalism. None of this is accidental. Systems evolve too, and many have learned how to press exactly the psychological buttons evolution installed for other purposes. If we continue to rely on an ancient, always say yes strategy in such an environment, we do not become kinder or more virtuous. We become predictable. And predictability is the raw material of manipulation. When others can reliably anticipate your inability to refuse, your apparent generosity stops being a gift and becomes a resource they can harvest. From a systems perspective, this is unstable. A system that cannot regulate its inputs eventually degrades. Minds are no exception. Without the capacity to say, no agency erodes quietly, not through force, but through exhaustion. So the real illusion here is the belief that constant agreement is morally superior. That belief confuses social lubrication with ethical excellence. Saying yes indiscriminately does not signal goodness. It signals the absence of filters. Philosophical maturity consists in recognizing when inherited intuitions no longer serve their original function. To see the social pressure to agree for what it is, a once useful adaptation, now operating out of context, is the first step toward reclaiming reflective control. Only then can saying no become not a betrayal of our social nature, but an intelligent refinement of it. Much of my philosophical work has focused on free will, not as a magical power floating outside the laws of nature, but as a practical capacity embedded in real biological systems. Free will, on this view, is something organisms gradually acquire as they become better at anticipating consequences, weighing alternatives, and responding to reasons. It is not an all or nothing miracle. It is a set of competences that can be strengthened or weakened. Human freedom lives in these competences, not in some metaphysical spark. So when we talk about freedom seriously, we are talking about the conditions under which people can actually govern their own behavior in light of what they understand about the world and about themselves. This leads to a simple but profound claim that often makes people uncomfortable. If you cannot say no, your yes has no meaning. A choice that cannot be refused is not a choice at all, no matter how politely it is framed. Imagine a lever you are forced to pull, but are praised for pulling willingly. The praise does not transform compulsion into freedom. Similarly, when agreement is automatic, socially coerced, or psychologically unavoidable, it does not count as an expression of agency. Freedom requires the genuine availability of alternatives, including the alternative to decline. Without that option, what looks like consent is merely compliance wearing a friendly mask. When you say yes automatically, without reflection, you are not exercising freedom. You are running a reflex. Reflexes are marvelous things. They keep us alive when there is no time to think. But they are the wrong tools for navigating moral, professional, and personal commitments in a complex society. Reflexive agreement bypasses evaluation. It skips the step where reasons are examined and consequences imagined. In those moments, the mind is not steering, it is being steered. Philosophically speaking, this is not a failure of character. It is a failure of control architecture, a system defaulting to an old setting that no longer fits the task at hand. Saying no, by contrast, is often the moment when genuine agency first appears. It is the moment when the automatic flow of behavior is interrupted, when the system hesitates and consults its models of the future. This hesitation is not weakness, it is sophistication. It signals that the mind is doing what it evolved and later learned to do: simulate outcomes before committing resources. In my work, I've emphasized that this capacity for mental rehearsal is one of the great achievements of human cognition. Saying no is frequently the outward sign that such rehearsal has taken place. In that reflective moment, you implicitly ask a series of questions, whether or not you put them into words. What am I being asked to do? Why am I being asked? Who benefits if I agree, and who bears the cost? What other commitments will this displace? These are not selfish questions, they are responsibility questions. To ignore them is not generosity, but negligence. An agent who never asks these questions cannot reliably align actions with values. Reflection is how values get traction in the real world, rather than remaining abstract slogans we admire, but never enact. This pause, this reflective gap, is where human freedom lies. It is small, often fleeting, and easily overridden by pressure or habit, yet it is enormously powerful. In that gap, we are not bound by immediate impulse or social momentum. We can reconsider, revise, and sometimes resist. Importantly, this gap can be cultivated. Practices that normalize delay, explanation, and boundary setting expand it. Environments that punish hesitation or glorify instant compliance shrink it. Freedom, on this account, is not merely something you have, it is something that can be eroded or enhanced by the structures around you. Responsibility follows confirming this view of freedom. We rightly hold people responsible not because they are metaphysically uncaused causers, but because they possess, to varying degrees, this capacity for reflective control. Learning to say no strengthens that capacity. It sharpens the link between reasons and actions. Over time, it turns agency from a fragile moment into a stable trait. When refusal is possible, agreement becomes meaningful. When reflection is allowed, commitment becomes authentic. And in that alignment between thought and action, we find a freedom worth wanting and worth protecting. We often treat saying no as a personality trait. We label people quickly and confidently. She's assertive, he's a people pleaser, as if these descriptions explain everything worth knowing. But this habit of labeling conceals more than it reveals. It suggests that our responses to requests are fixed features of temperament, like eye color or height. From a philosophical and scientific point of view, that is deeply misleading. When we reify behavior into character traits, we absolve ourselves of responsibility for improvement. We stop asking how the behavior works, why it occurs, and whether it can be redesigned. That is not explanation, it is surrender disguised as insight. That's a mistake. Saying no is not a personality trait etched permanently into your psychological makeup. It is a performance, and performances depend on skills. Treating it otherwise encourages fatalism. That's just how I am. But human beings are not static objects. They are adaptive systems. We revise strategies when feedback tells us they no longer serve us well. Once you recognize that refusal is something you do rather than something you are, the conversation changes. The question shifts from, why am I like this? To, what am I doing And how could I do it better? That shift is the beginning of cognitive empowerment. Saying no is a cognitive skill, a learned competence. Like language, like reasoning, like moral judgment. It improves with practice and degrades with neglect. Children are not born knowing how to refuse diplomatically or responsibly. They experiment, fail, and gradually refine their approach. Adults are no different, except that we often stop experimenting. We rely on habits formed under different pressures and in different environments. Skills, however, are not frozen by age. They remain plastic. When refusal is treated as a skill, mistakes become data, not evidence of moral deficiency. In cognitive science, we talk about the mind as a collection of competences, not a single unified thing issuing commands from a central headquarters. You are not one decision maker. You are many processes negotiating with one another, sometimes cooperatively, sometimes competitively. Some processes are fast and emotional, others slow and deliberative. Some evolved for social bonding, others for long-term planning. Saying no successfully often requires coordinating these processes so that short-term discomfort does not override long-term goals. Understanding this internal negotiation helps demystify why refusal can feel so difficult even when it is clearly justified. When you feel guilty saying no, that guilt is not the voice of moral truth speaking from on high. It is one internal process, an ancient one, trying to protect social harmony at all costs. Its job, historically, was to prevent you from doing things that might get you ostracized or harmed. In many situations, it still does that job well. But it has no built-in understanding of modern calendars, burnout, or exploitative demands. Treating guilt as an infallible moral compass is like treating a smoke alarm as a fire investigator. It detects danger, but it cannot diagnose context. Wisdom consists in listening to that voice without obeying it blindly. Mature cognition does not silence uncomfortable signals, it interprets them. When guilt arises, the reflective response is not automatic compliance, but inquiry. What is this feeling responding to? Is the perceived threat real or outdated? What are the downstream effects of agreeing versus refusing? This evaluative stance transforms emotional reactions into informational inputs. Over time, the system recalibrates. Guilt loses its veto power and becomes one consideration among many rather than the final authority. Once you understand saying no as a cognitive skill, improvement becomes both possible and measurable. You can practice in low-stakes situations, refine your language, and observe outcomes. You can notice when refusals preserve energy, clarify commitments, and increase trust rather than erode it. Gradually, the internal negotiations change. Processes that once dominated learn to share control. The result is not hardness or detachment, but competence. And competence, philosophically speaking, is what turns good intentions into reliable action in a complicated world. Paradoxically, the people who learn to say no well are often the most trustworthy, because when they say yes, it actually means something. In 7 paragraphs, keep in mind that this must be in the Dennett style. Each paragraph must consist of 1,000 characters. No need to assign numbers to paragraphs, and also avoid to give headings. One of the most dangerous cultural myths is the idea that goodness equals constant availability. We are subtly taught that being a good person means being easy to access, easy to persuade, and easy to burden. If you are always reachable, always agreeable, always willing, then you are praised as kind. This story is deeply comforting because it is simple, but simplicity is often the enemy of truth. Philosophically speaking, equating moral worth with perpetual openness collapses a complex set of virtues into a single behavioral reflex. It ignores context, capacity, and consequence. In doing so, it replaces moral reasoning with social signaling, rewarding appearances of niceness over the substance of ethical action. But consider this carefully and not sentimentally. If you say yes to everything, what actually happens over time? Your attention fragments as it is pulled in too many directions at once. Your commitments weaken because no single promise receives the care it deserves. Your promises lose credibility because others learn, often unconsciously, that your yes does not reliably predict delivery. None of this requires bad intentions. It is the predictable outcome of overload. A finite system faced with infinite demands must degrade. This is not a moral judgment, it is a design constraint. Ignoring it does not make you noble, it makes you unreliable. From a systems perspective, this situation is disastrous. Any system that cannot refuse input will eventually collapse under noise, congestion, or exhaustion. We know this from engineering, from biology, and from computer science. Filters are not optional, they are essential. Yet when it comes to our own minds, we pretend otherwise. We imagine that moral virtue exempts us from the laws that govern all other complex systems. But the brain is not a miracle machine. It is an evolved, resource-limited system that must allocate attention, energy, and time intelligently or fail its own objectives. Your mind is such a system. It has bandwidth limits, recovery needs, and competing priorities. When you override these limits in the name of niceness, you are not transcending human nature, you are abusing it. Burnout is not evidence of excessive compassion, it is evidence of poor regulation. Philosophically, this matters because moral responsibility depends on capacity. You cannot be responsible for what you can no longer competently manage. Protecting your cognitive resources is not a retreat from goodness, it is a prerequisite for it. Real kindness, then, is not unlimited compliance. Real kindness is reliable contribution. It is showing up fully where you have committed, not half-heartedly everywhere you were afraid to refuse. Reliability requires boundaries because boundaries create predictability. When people know what you can and cannot do, they can plan around you. When you say yes sparingly but sincerely, coordination improves. Trust deepens not because you are endlessly accommodating, but because your actions align with your words. In this way, limits do not undermine cooperation, they stabilize it. Paradoxically, the people who learn to say no well are often the most trustworthy. This surprises us because it clashes with the myth of niceness. But trust is not built on frequency of agreement, it is built on accuracy. When someone who often says no finally says yes, we pay attention, we believe them. Their consent carries informational weight. In contrast, habitual agreement becomes background noise. It reassures in the moment, but disappoints in the long run. From an epistemic standpoint, selective refusal increases the signal to noise ratio of social commitments. So the myth of niceness dissolves when examined through the lens of design, responsibility, and truth. Goodness is not measured by how often you are available, but by how dependably you contribute where it matters. Saying no is not a withdrawal from moral life, it is a calibration of it. By refusing what you cannot sustain, you protect what you can, and in doing so, You transform niceness from a superficial performance into something far more valuable, a pattern of action that others can genuinely rely on. In my work on evolution and culture, I often talk about design without a designer. Complex structures arise, not because someone planned them in advance, but because variation and selection gradually shape what works. Minds, habits, and institutions are products of this process. They are not engineered top-down. They are refined bottom-up through feedback. This perspective is crucial because it removes the temptation to look for a single moment of control or a grand decision that defines who you are. Instead, it invites us to see ourselves as evolving systems, continually modified by the small choices we repeat and the pressures we allow to shape us. You can apply this insight inward, and doing so is one of the most powerful philosophical moves you can make. Instead of treating your behavior as the expression of a fixed self, you can treat it as material for ongoing design. This does not require perfection or radical transformation. Evolution works incrementally. Small differences, repeated consistently, accumulate into significant change. When you recognize that your responses to everyday requests are part of this process, they stop being trivial. They become inputs into the selective environment that is shaping your future self, whether you are paying attention or not. Think of your life as an ongoing design project, but one without a blueprint and without a final version. There is no completed model you must match. There are only trajectories, directions in which your habits are nudging you. Each commitment you accept or decline alters that trajectory slightly. From a distance, these adjustments may seem negligible, but over time they compound. Just as natural selection has no foresight yet produces remarkable complexity, your repeated choices can generate a coherent character without any single dramatic act of will. Every time you say yes or no, you reinforce a pattern. Patterns that are reinforced become habits, and habits are the real engines of behavior. We like to think that character is revealed only in moments of crisis, but character is mostly built in mundane situations where the stakes feel low. Do you default to agreement under pressure? Or do you pause and evaluate? Do you protect your attention, or do you spend it impulsively? These micro decisions quietly sculpt your cognitive and moral profile long before you notice the results. Over time, those habits become character, and character shapes destiny, not through fate or prophecy, but through probability. A person who habitually overcommits will predictably face burnout, resentment, and diminished effectiveness. A person who practices selective commitment will predictably earn trust and maintain agency. These outcomes are not moral rewards or punishments. They are the natural consequences of how systems behave. Seen this way, destiny is not something that happens to you. It is something that emerges from the patterns you tolerate and reinforce. So the question is not, should I say no this once? That framing is too narrow and too forgiving. It treats the decision as isolated, as though it leaves no residue behind. The more revealing question is, what kind of person is this choice training me to become? That question shifts attention from immediate comfort to long-term design. It forces you to acknowledge that each decision is a vote cast for a future version of yourself, one that will inherit the habits you are building now. A well-placed no, then, is an act of self-authorship. It is not a rejection of others, but a declaration about the structure you are constructing within yourself. Authorship does not mean total control, it means meaningful influence over direction. By saying no strategically, you participate in the evolutionary process shaping your own mind. You do not escape selection pressures, but you can redirect them. And in that redirection lies a form of freedom that is not mystical, but practical, durable, and deeply human. There is another dimension to this discussion, and it is a moral one that cannot be ignored. We often talk about ethics as if it were primarily about good intentions, but moral responsibility is better understood as a capacity for control within systems that exert pressure. Human beings rarely act in isolation. We act inside organizations, traditions, chains of command, and incentive structures. Moral failure, more often than not, does not arise from cruelty, but from passivity. It arises when individuals allow systems to carry them along without resistance, surrendering judgment in exchange for comfort, safety, or approval. History is full of atrocities carried out not by monsters, but by ordinary people who relied on familiar justifications. I was just following orders. I didn't want to cause trouble. Everyone else agreed. These statements are not expressions of hatred. They are expressions of abdicated agency. They mark the point at which individuals stop seeing themselves as responsible nodes in a moral network and began to see themselves as replaceable parts in a machine. Philosophically, this is a failure of refusal. The inability or unwillingness to say no becomes the mechanism through which harm scales up and stabilizes. What is striking is how psychologically ordinary these failures are. The same social instincts that make us cooperative also make us vulnerable to normalization. When harmful practices become routine, they stop feeling like choices and start feeling like facts. At that point, refusal feels eccentric, even dangerous. Yet this is precisely when refusal matters most. Moral responsibility does not require heroic defiance in every moment. It requires the preservation of judgment when pressures push toward automatic compliance. Saying no in such contexts is not a dramatic gesture. It is the quiet maintenance of agency under strain. Moral progress, when it occurs, depends on people who can say no to unjust norms, to destructive traditions, to incentives that reward harm while disguising it as efficiency or loyalty. These individuals are rarely celebrated at first. They are often seen as obstacles, troublemakers, or idealists. But from a long-term perspective, they perform an essential function. They introduce variation into moral ecosystems that have grown stagnant. Without such variation, bad systems persist not because they are optimal, but because nothing disrupts them. From this perspective, learning to say no is not merely self-help or personal boundary setting. It is civic virtue. Democracies, scientific communities, and ethical institutions all rely on members who can resist local pressures in the name of broader standards. Whistleblowers, conscientious objectors, and principled dissenters are not anomalies. They are indicators of moral health. A community in which refusal is impossible is not harmonious. It is brittle. It may function smoothly for a time, but it lacks the internal checks required for correction. Systems like minds evolve. If they reward compliance without reflection, they select for passivity. Over time, responsibility diffuses until no one feels accountable for outcomes everyone contributes to. This diffusion is not accidental. It is a predictable consequence of environments that penalize refusal. Saying no interrupts this process. It forces systems to confront their own assumptions. It reintroduces the idea that participation is conditional, not automatic, and that legitimacy must be earned, not merely enforced. A society of people who cannot refuse is a society waiting to be exploited. Exploitation does not require villains, it requires predictable compliance. When refusal is stigmatized, power concentrates and accountability evaporates. Teaching people how to say no clearly, rationally, and responsibly is therefore not a luxury. It is a safeguard. It preserves the link between individual judgment and collective action. And in preserving that link, it keeps moral responsibility from dissolving into mere procedure, which is where it so often goes to die. Let me offer some practical, philosophically grounded principles, but keep in mind that practical does not mean shallow. These principles are practical in the way good engineering is practical. They respect constraints, anticipate failure modes, and improve reliability over time. Saying no well is not about adopting a rigid rule, but about cultivating better control over when and how you commit yourself. The goal is not to refuse more often, but to refuse more intelligently. Each principle is best understood not as a moral commandment, but as a cognitive tool, something to deploy when the situation calls for it. First, delay is not dishonesty. We often feel pressured to respond immediately as though hesitation itself were a form of deception. But this is a confusion. You are allowed to pause. Reflection is not rudeness. It is evidence that you are taking the request seriously. In cognitive terms, delay creates space for simulation. It allows slower, more deliberative processes to weigh in before faster, socially conditioned responses take over. When you say, "Let me think about that," you are not evading responsibility. You are exercising it. Cultures that equate immediacy with sincerity systematically undermine good judgment. Second, reasons beat excuses. An excuse is designed to deflect disappointment. A reason is designed to communicate reality. When you offer a clear reason for saying no, you respect both parties by treating the decision as intelligible rather than arbitrary. Reasons make your refusal part of a shared rational space. They allow others to adjust expectations and plans. Excuses, by contrast, invite negotiation, suspicion, or guilt. From a philosophical standpoint, giving reasons is how agents recognize one another as participants in a community of justification. It is not about defending yourself, it is about making your decision legible. Third, no is a complete sentence, but context matters. Clarity is essential because ambiguity often functions as false hope. However, clarity need not be cruelty. Human beings are not abstract agents, they are emotionally responsive systems. Tone, timing, and framing matter because they shape how information is processed. The art lies in refusing without obscuring. A clean no, delivered with appropriate context, minimizes confusion and resentment. Philosophically, this reflects a balance between precision and empathy, between truthfulness and social understanding, neither of which should be sacrificed unnecessarily. Fourth, practice in low-stakes situations. Competence grows through rehearsal, not through sudden tests of willpower. If you only try to say no when the stakes are highest, you are setting yourself up for failure. Cognitive skills develop incrementally. Low-stakes refusals allow you to experiment with language, timing, and emotional regulation. They provide feedback without severe consequences. Over time, what once felt threatening becomes routine. This is not desensitization in a moral sense, it is calibration. You are teaching your nervous system that Refusal does not automatically lead to disaster. Fifth, notice the relief. That subtle sense of relief after a thoughtful no is evidence, not of selfishness, but of alignment. It signals that competing internal processes have reached a stable agreement. When your actions line up with your reasons, cognitive friction decreases. This feeling is informative. It tells you that the system is functioning well, that resources have been preserved rather than overextended. Ignoring this signal in favor of chronic guilt is like ignoring pain in a damaged joint. Relief is not a moral verdict, but it is a valuable diagnostic. Taken together, these principles point toward a larger lesson. Saying no well is not about hardening yourself against others. It is about coordinating your internal capacities with the external demands you face. Each refusal, when done thoughtfully, strengthens the link between reflection and action. Over time, this link becomes reliable. And reliability of judgment, of commitment, of character, is what turns a collection of good intentions into a life that actually works. Let me conclude by returning to where we began, with that small, powerful word that carries far more weight than its size would suggest. No looks insignificant on the page and sounds abrupt in the ear, yet it performs an essential function in the architecture of agency. It marks a boundary, and boundaries are what make structures possible. Without them, there is only sprawl. Philosophically, this is the right lens through which to see refusal not as negation for its own sake, but as a structural element in a system that must allocate finite resources. When we understand this, the emotional drama surrounding the word begins to dissolve, and what remains is a question of design. No is not the enemy of cooperation. It is the foundation of meaningful cooperation. Cooperation requires coordination, and coordination requires predictability. If everything is always accepted, nothing is reliably delivered. From the standpoint of social epistemology, a yes that cannot be withheld carries little information. It tells us nothing about priorities or limits. A no, by contrast, clarifies the shape of a person's commitments. It signals where effort will not be spent so that we can infer where it will. In this way, refusal does not fracture social bonds, it renders them intelligible. When you learn the art of saying no, several things happen simultaneously, and none of them are accidental. Your yes becomes honest, because it is no longer issued under duress or inertia. Your commitments become credible, because they are fewer and better chosen. Your values become visible because they are no longer obscured by indiscriminate agreement. Values that never constrain behavior are decorative. They look impressive, but they do no work. Saying no is how values exert causal influence in the world, shaping actions rather than merely decorating self-conceptions. From a philosophical standpoint, this is what it means to be a responsible agent in a complex world. Responsibility is not about bearing infinite burdens. It is about managing limited capacities wisely. A responsible agent is not a puppet of impulses or pressures, but a reflective system capable of self-correction. Such a system notices when inherited habits no longer serve current goals and adjusts accordingly. The ability to say no is one of the primary mechanisms by which this adjustment occurs. It is how reflection intervenes in automaticity and redirects behavior toward reasons. So the next time you hesitate to say no, do not ask yourself whether it will make you uncomfortable. Discomfort is cheap and temporary. Its presence tells you very little. Ask instead whether refusing is is the price of being the person you want to become? That question reframes the moment from a social risk to a design choice. It shifts attention from immediate approval to long-term integrity. Philosophically, this is the move from impulse management to self-authorship, from reacting to shaping. Because a life without no is not a life of generosity. It is a life without authorship. It is a life in which actions accumulate without direction, shaped more by external demands than by internal reasons. Such a life may look busy and accommodating, but it lacks narrative coherence. Authorship does not require control over everything. It requires influence over trajectory. Saying no, when done thoughtfully, is how you exert that influence, steering the pattern of your commitments rather than being carried by them. And learning to say no, carefully, thoughtfully, responsibly, is therefore one of the most human skills we can ever acquire. It is not a rejection of our social nature, but a refinement of it. It allows cooperation to be grounded in truth rather than pressure, and responsibility to be anchored in competence rather than exhaustion. In mastering this small word, we do not become less humane, we become more so, because we reclaim the freedom to mean what we say. Thank you.